DESIblitz.com.
Hello, I'm Imtiaz Dharker and welcome to this reading tonight. I'll read some of my older work, some new work from over 7 books and a few years of writing poetry. I'm glad that you could join me tonight on these nights that are getting colder. And I'm glad that you can join me for an evening of poetry because these are strident times and it's too easy for quieter voices not to be heard. It's a time when maybe subtleties and nuances are sometimes lost in the great chaos and white noise that surrounds us, when words have been very often lose their meaning in the kind of devaluation of the way that they're used. And people have been turning to poetry more and more with all that's been happening to us recently. So I hope this will be a reading that will speak to you as well, and that you will be listening to lots more poetry as well. I start with a poem I wrote, I think it was probably more than 20 years ago, but unfortunately, its time seems to have come round again. When I can't comprehend why they're burning books or closing borders, when they can't bear to look at God's own nakedness, when they ban the film and gut the seats to stop the play, and I ask why, they just smile and say, she must be from another country. When I speak on the phone and the vowel sounds are off, when the consonants are hard and they should be soft, they'll catch on at once, they'll pin it down, they'll explain it right away to their own satisfaction. They'll cluck their tongues and say, she must be from another country. When my mouth goes up instead of down, when I wear a tablecloth to go to town, when they suspect I'm black or think I'm gay, they won't be surprised. They'll purse their lips and say, she must be from another country. Maybe there is a country where all of us live, all of us freaks who aren't able to give our loyalty to lying fools, the crooks and thugs who wear the uniform that gives them the right to wave a flag, puff out their chests, put their feet on our necks and break their own rules. But from where we are, it doesn't look like a country. It's more like the cracks that grow between borders behind their backs. That's where I live. And I'll be happy to say I never learned their customs. I don't remember their language or know their ways. I must be from another country. I lived for many years in Bombay, which, as you know, is now called Mumbai. And it's a city with 2 names and 2 faces, and many different faces, actually. But it has begun to see itself as a great economic miracle. At the same time, if you look at it visually, it's a city that looks as if it's held up with sticks and string and scaffolding. And to me, that began to look like an image for what the whole world is going through, a kind of place that's held up by some kind of miracle. Scaffolding. If I were a house shored up like this, with ancient scaffolding, the threat of bars for windows, damp roof and door of tin, would you take the time to walk into my face, to move from room to room and find the quiet space where I begin? Would you be tempted to come in? I read one that I wrote very recently. I was thinking about how leaders from many different countries are willfully choosing to bypass reason and conscience and make their excuses in language that's been devalued and corrupted, and words that have been devalued too. And in the poem I wrote, I used a kind of bureaucratic word, a word of false excuses. However, I tried to turn it around and suggest the human will, the breath, the human breath that survives. In the face of news and noise and toxic opinion masquerading as fact, Poetry listens for the voice of the silenced, and it pays close attention, not just to words being said, but who is saying them and why. However, she buried the book under the peach tree, but it would not stay put. First a scribbled shoot, then the stalks appeared and spelt out the name of their god in upright strokes that made it clear what she had hidden. It sprouted the telltale script of their language. The garden was humming with what she planted among the mint leaves that flavored her fingers and clung to her hands. Whatever she did, she is gone to learn a new script. The phone rings in a hollowed house, but whoever it is at the other end of the line gives up and the ringing stops. The peaches drop with the sound of soft bodies. Whoever was taken was due to be processed. Whatever was said or implied, the lie was retracted, the question redirected. There is nothing to see here but a woman reading, nothing to hear but her finger moving on paper, no harm intended. However, it is true the body is broken. However, the eyes are live. The tongue remembers the hint of cumin, peach juice splashed down the chin, the taste of a life before barbed womb, barred door, bared teeth in the jaws of power. However, the breath is butterfly. I grew up in Glasgow, and sometimes out of the grey Glasgow day, my father would bring me something that he'd bought off a barrow in the marketplace in a brown paper bag. But to me, it looked as if it didn't just come from another country, it was from another planet, a kind of mythical thing. How to cut a pomegranate. Never, said my father, never cut a pomegranate through the heart. It will weep blood. Treat it delicately, with respect. Just slit the upper skin across 4 quarters. This is a magic fruit, so when you split it open, be prepared for the jewels of the world to tumble out, more precious than garnets, more lustrous than rubies, lit as if from inside. Each jewel contains a living seed. Separate one crystal, hold it up to catch the light. Inside is a whole universe. No common jewel can give you this. Afterwards, I tried to make necklaces of pomegranate seeds. The juice spurted out bright crimson and stained my fingers, then my mouth. I didn't mind. The juice tasted of gardens I'd never seen, voluptuous with myrtle, lemon, jasmine, and alive with parrot's wings. The pomegranate reminded me that somewhere I had another home. And when I was in Glasgow, my father was always very proud of understanding local habits and customs, but he was especially proud of speaking the language like a local. I found this very embarrassing. But this one's called Chaudhry Sher Mubarak Looks at the Loch. Light shakes out the dish-rag sky and scatters the water with sequins. Look, hen, says my father, Loch Lomond. As if it were all his doing, as if he owned it. Laird of Lomond, laird of the language. He's proud to say hen, and even more loch, with an och, not an och, to speak proper Glaswegian like a true-born Scot. And he makes the right sound at the back of the throat, because he can say hush and hua and chamosh. Because the sounds for happy and dream are the words that swim in the water for him. So he says it again. Hen, look, the loch. And all the time that I was growing up in Glasgow, I was sure that real life was going on somewhere else, in some other country, somewhere where I was not. And when I met my husband, Simon Powell, he said he felt exactly the same growing up in Wales. So I think it's not to do, of course, with anything to do with the place. It's more to do with being young and wanting to get out. So this one's called In Wales, Wanting to be Italian. And if any of you know German, please excuse my imaginary German. Is there a name for that thing you do when you're young? There must be a word for it in some language, probably German. Or if not, it's just asking to be made up. Something like Fremdlandisch Gehör und Lust, or perhaps Ein so Mann das Land Gehör und Wunsch. What is it called? Living in Glasgow, dying to be French, dying to shrug and pout and make yourself understood without saying a word. Have you ever felt like that? Being in Bombay, wanting to declare, like Freddie Mercury, that you are from somewhere like Zanzibar? What is that called? Being 16 in Wales, longing to be Italian, to be able to say aloud without embarrassment, Bella, Bella. Lounge by a Vespa with a cigarette hanging out of your mouth and wear impossibly pointed shoes. Another poem that I've written very recently is called Backseat. I was thinking about back and where home is, and I had a whole series of poems based around the idea of being back, going back, belonging, not belonging. Backseat. He looks so young, his hands bony at the wheel. I wonder if he's been out all night, what he might have had for breakfast, and what he eats when his shift ends, whether his mother makes him Punjabi samosas, or Bengali mustard fish, or Kerala rice, if he prefers the mangoes of the north, like me, or the sweeter ones from further south. Before I can stop them, the words fall out of my mouth. And where are you from? I mean, your people. They land somewhere on the back of his neck, slide into the rear view mirror, roll into his eyes. He looks back for 1 second, and his face is a passport, and his back is a flag, and he says, Barnsley, and I pay and get out. On the day that we began to realize how our lives were going to change in the lockdown, the first lockdown, how parents would be separated from their children, I was looking out over London from the window here, and I can see the horizon of London. And I felt as if I could hear the phone calls all over the world, people separated and searching for words of hope and consolation to give each other. Cranes lean in, waiting for an all clear that will not come. Forehead pressed to glass, phone at my ear. I learned to sail on your voice over a sadness of building sites, past King's Cross, St. Pancras, to the place where you are. You say, nothing is too far. Mothers will find their daughters. Strangers will be neighbors. Even saviors will have names. You're all flame in a red dress. Petals brush my face. You say at last the cherry blossom has arrived, as if that is what we were really waiting for. And I don't know if you remember those incredible spring days when the whole world seemed to blossom and things went very quiet except for the sound of birds. Well, this is an older poem which takes me back to a time before that lockdown when cafes were open and there was constant noise, especially languages, the noise of voices from everywhere in the world. Medium. All life is out there, spending, spendthrift with its silver, like a drunk on moonshine. Across the coffee shop, baristas are calling out to one another in Malayalam, Coffee burbles in Spanish. The streets are a torrent of passing Italian. Windows fly open on Punjabi. Even songbirds are chirping in accents. Valleys, Geordie, Bhojpuri. This upturned glass is mute, but wants to go screeching across the table, its mouth ravenous for word of you. The world is squandering its currency of languages. Save one. Speak to me. My husband, I mentioned earlier, Simon, he was a great talker. And when there was no one else to talk to, I'd hear him speaking to himself, and he'd be out in the workshop. I'd hear him talking gently to a motorbike, or scolding a saw or a drill, and even sometimes arguing with an electric bill. Undone. That tongue of yours is silver when you speak, and silver when the speaking's done. Those eyes have a look that turns my quick to silver and proves my body's not my own, but away on loan to your fingers, bold in their skillful wheeling and their dealing. Your mouth, the alchemist, I'm gold, blown through the eggshell of the ceiling into a clear Murano sky. All that goes with me is the scent of you, which could be the scent of me, for there is no I or you, flung as we are to glassy blue. See how well I'm undone with one touch of your silenced silver tongue. And this one's called Hidayat Old Bombay. Hidayat is one of those almost untranslatable Welsh words that means something in the region of a longing for something that's no longer there, or maybe never was. And Bombay, as we know, is a city whose name has been changed. I would have taken you to the Naz Cafe if it had not shut down. I would have taken you to the Naz Cafe for the best view and the worst food in town. We would have drunk tea. We would have drunk flat beer and cream soda and sweated on plastic chairs at the Naz Cafe. We would have looked down over the dusty trees at cars creeping along Marine Drive, round the bay to Eros Cinema and the talk of the town. We would have held hands in the Naz Cafe, over sticky rings on the tabletop, knee locked on knee at the Naz Cafe, while we admired the distant stock exchange, Taj Mahal Hotel, Sassoon-Dock, Gateway. We would have nursed a drink at the Naz Cafe, and you would have stolen a kiss from me. We would have lingered in the Naz Cafe till the day slid off the map into the Arabian Sea. I would have taken you to Bombay if its name had not slid into the sea. I would have taken you to the place called Bombay if it were still there, and if you were still here. I would have taken you to the Naz Cafe. And after Simon died, there was a dream I had about him coming back, and I tried for many months to write that poem, for a very long time, to write that dream into a poem. And I wasn't able to do it because somehow it didn't fit, it didn't work. It's very hard to write a dream in a poem and make it work. But it was only when I came to write in a sonnet form, I wrote a sonnet, and suddenly the dream appeared in the middle of the sonnet. And there was something about the formality of the sonnet, the form, that made it possible to write the poem, the dream into the poem. The trick. In a wasted time, it's only when I sleep that all my senses come awake. In the wake of you, let day not break. Let me keep the scent, the weight, the bright of you. Take the countless hours and count them all night through till that time comes when you come to the door of dreams, carrying oranges that cast a glow up into your face. Greedy for more than the gift of seeing you, I lean in to taste the color, kiss it off your offered mouth. For this, I fall asleep in haste, willing to fall for the trick that tells the truth, that even your shade makes darkest absence bright, that shadows live wherever there is light. And the last poem I'll read before I take questions, maybe, is based around a phrase that you hear again and again. Sometimes you hear a phrase that has a kind of a rhythm that sticks in your mind. And that's what happened when I heard the same phrase on television and in news reports. And it's something that seems to have stuck in the throat of the English language wherever it's spoken. The first part of this poem is made up of things that people actually said, just rearranged a little. Speech balloon. The Barnsley manager was lost for words to describe his feelings when Chelsea fell to the Tykes. We played fantastic. I never thought we'd do it again, but we did. And all I can say is, I'm over the moon, he said. I'm over the moon, he said. Bollywood's hottest couple was proud to be blessed by the jubilant father, the superstar. It's a match made in heaven, he said to the press, between two shooting stars with shining careers. And I'm over the moon, of course, he said. I'm over the moon, he said. The Malaysian nation went mad with joy on Independence Day in his 50th year when a doctor-cum part-time model, a local boy, went up into space in a Russian Soyuz and in zero gravity performed his namaz. All of Malaysia over the moon, they said on the news, 27 million people over the moon. You must have noticed. It's really quite clear. This condition has spread. It's happening there. It's happening here. It's full-blown, grown beyond every border to the furthest corner of every country where English is spoken or English is known. There's no one just satisfied or mildly pleased or chipper or chirpy, contented or cheerful. No one glad or gratified, delighted or jubilant, elated, ecstatic, joyful or gleeful. All the happy people have left this world. You won't come across them anytime soon. And if it's happy sound bites you're looking for, you need to look way over your head for the words and balloons to the place where the cow keeps jumping over and over with all the footballers, team managers and lottery winners, world superstars, heroes and champions and legends and lovers and proud mums and dads and the whole of Malaysia, over the moon, over the moon, over the moon. Thank you. And now if you have any questions, maybe you could put them up and Fiona, who's there, will pass them on to me. Is Fiona going to read those out to me?
Hi, Imtiaz. Sorry. Hello. How are you?
Hello. Very well. Thank you. Good.
Well, we've had a lovely comment from Parveen Khan, who just says brilliant, and of course it has been brilliant. So thank you so much for this evening. And ask a simple question: how did you get into poetry?
Well,
I say simple.
Well, it's a funny thing, but I think all of us, people, when people turn to poetry, first of all, when you're a child, you play and use language and make it hop and skip and jump and treat language like a kind of a game. And I think that's something that children have, and that sometimes we forget later that is what poetry is. It's using language to play with, really, to use in the best possible way you can. And then, of course, later it becomes about expressing emotion as well, and maybe using some craft and discipline to express that emotion. But I suppose I kept writing because at some point I fell in love with an older man. He was 14. I was 11. So I wrote these poems. I wrote to him. And of course, he never knew. He was the little boy across the road, and I'd see him, kicking his legs up in the window, doing his exercises. And I was in love, and I was writing poems. So he never knew that I was writing poems to him. And I never knew his name, but I began to write. And although he never knew, I found that I was being answered back by poets from all over, from the library that I was going to. Robert Burns, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, Shakespeare, John Donne. So other poets answered back, even if the little boy never did. I think being in love, being a strong emotion, is another reason that young people come to writing poetry. And then after that, of course, it's a case of getting that emotion and turning it into something that is really a poem and not just a splurge of emotion. It's a case of cutting away words, crafting it, giving it some kind of form that makes it say what you want to say, and also say something to other people as well.
We have another question here from Adriana. She asks, do you have authors that inspire you the most? And I guess actually the straight answer to that is yes. So perhaps we should say, what authors inspire you the most?
Well, it started when I was very young with Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was a wonderful, and when I talked about playing with language, he was a great player with language. And I began to realize what poetry could do when I first read Gerard Manley Hopkins. William Blake was a great influence, because he was mixing image and poetry and a kind of visionary idea of how the world could be. He was way ahead of his time in his political views, in the way he saw the world. So he was a great experience. And then, of course, afterwards, I discovered poets from all over the world, women poets, people like Carol Ann Duffy, and contemporary poets whom I really admire. Every day I'm finding a new inspiration, because there are people who are writing who are doing such incredible, energetic, inventive, beautiful things with words. I mean, there's 26 letters in the alphabet, but there are so many ways of handling them and doing them and making them mean something to another person. So I'm hearing young poets, new poets, people who might be 50 and have just started writing, but all of them, and as I said, people from all over the world who are writing things that inspire me even now. I sometimes read a poem in a competition entry. I've been reading a lot of competition entries lately, and someone I've never heard of before, and I wish, what, it's a great sign when you say, I wish I had written that. You really wish that was something you had written. So that's an inspiration too. I feel every life is inspiring.
Your lovely story has inspired a comment from Charlie. He says, I love the idea of the poets in the library answering back. Wonder if that 14-year-old boy opposite has since read your work and never knew he missed those first poems. Yeah, if he's read it now, he'll be kicking himself, won't he?
I wrote a poem called Alan or David or John, so maybe he's one of those names.
Here's an interesting question from Aisha. I teach your poem Tissue for GCSE literature. It's in the Power and Conflict anthology. Yeah. So I'm just curious, she says, what inspired you to write it?
Well, I was looking at a book. It was the Quran, and I was looking at the back of the book, and on the tissue paper at the back, I saw that my father had written very carefully my name and date of birth in his beautiful handwriting. And looking at it, I began to think about what it is that families feel, what people feel for each other, what it is that makes them come together or argue, or what causes conflict. Because I had left home many years before and my father had died. And we had argued about politics and religion and all kinds of things, like about ways to live. But I began to think about what causes conflict. Is it these strict social structures, religion, politics, national borders? What is it people fight over? And I began to think about ways that we could work through this conflict. And I was thinking about paper and words and the kind of pieces of paper, the pieces of tissue, the things that we throw away because they mean nothing. We think they mean nothing, but they tell the real story of our lives. And of course, that I related then to human tissue, which is the thing that's thrown away so carelessly in war and times of conflict. So I was trying to do that poem is it's a hard poem. And, it's a hard one to teach, I know. And it's a hard one for pupils to study because I was really exploring an idea there. I had no answers. I was exploring an idea of how we can work past conflict to the things that really matter in life, birth and death and family and things that bring us together instead of driving us apart.
And interesting, it's in an anthology, Power and Conflict, and it is that quest for power that obviously causes so much conflict, whether it's on a national scale, an international scale, or an individual personal level, isn't it? And that is
absolutely right. And in fact, another thing I was thinking of when I wrote that poem, I was thinking of Ozymandias, the Shelley poem, the vast and trunkless legs of stone, where the monolithic symbols of power have fallen to rubble in the desert and been destroyed. And it is the impermanent things like human beings. Human beings are impermanent, but the human spirit survives. We continue. The colossus, the monuments fall, but we survive. The human will to survive is there.
We've got a question here now, a little bit more about the perhaps practicalities, I suppose, perhaps, from Geeta, who says, such a beautiful reading. So she thanks you for those beautiful readings. I wondered how you know when a poem is truly finished. Do you get a particular feeling? I seem to get lost in endless revisions, she says.
That's a hard one. That's so hard. And you ask any publisher, any poetry publisher, poets never feel they've actually finished. You always want to keep doing something else to it or make it better. There's always that quest for the better one. But with finishing, very often, it's a good idea to finish before it actually wraps itself up. Or if you've wrapped it up, go back to unwrapping it a little bit. I quite like, for example, in the poem I read, The Trick, I knew that, and in that one, I knew I had reached the end because it's a sonnet, and a sonnet ends with the rhyming couplet, that even your shade makes darkest absence bright, that shadows live wherever there is light. And in that one, I knew I had finished because there's an open-endedness in the line itself. Shadows live wherever there's light, that there's darkness even where there's light and happiness, but also it reads the other way, that even if when there's light, the ghost, the dead reappear. The shadow is alive and there because of the light. So, and I was, in the dream was waiting for Simon to come back. So in a way, there was a double edge to it, which meant that having written that line, I knew that I had written the last line of the poem, but that doesn't always happen. You're right. You can just go back. But keep writing, Geeta.
Oh, Geeta says thank you so much for your inspiration and to keep writing. I mean, you just mentioned there about knowing because you come to the end because it's a sonnet, and of course a sonnet has a structure anyway, doesn't it? It has that physical structure. I mean, when you're writing, do you have a preference for writing in a kind of established structure, or are you much more? Would you prefer the free verse, or do you allow the poems themselves to perhaps kind of explore the format that they end up in, if that makes any sense?
Oh, it does make sense, because that's exactly it. The poem finds its own form. Like, for example, in Tissue, which you mentioned, in Tissue, I was exploring an idea, so I didn't want a structure on that. In fact, it would have been against the idea of the poem to put a formal structure on it, because the whole poem is working against the structures that I see as restrictive and causing conflict. So I wouldn't have wanted that. So, and I was also exploring. So it's a kind of meandering poem where you begin to pull ideas out of the air, like, oh, where's another piece of tissue? It's a grocery slip, it's a bill, it's a receipt. And that tells the story of my life. If somebody looks at my receipts, they'd know what I do, they'd know who I am, they'd know my story, a lot of it at any rate. So I was exploring that idea. So that poem, its structure was very loose. And I didn't know where it was going to end. And usually you don't know where a poem's going to end anyway. But I left it loose. Sometimes it helps me when I'm thinking through an idea to work in a structure. And sometimes I keep that structure, as in The Trick and even Undone, which is another sonnet, the one I read before about the silver tongue. But sometimes I do that and then deliberately switch it up and rough it up and change the rhyme into the middle of the line and, push it around a little bit so that it's not as structured as it could be if I write the original sonnet. So I sometimes write it. The reason I find it lovely to write a short poem or a sonnet is that it's almost like taking a little window, and you see things more clearly if you frame it into that window. A sonnet, if you think about it, is a kind of a little window. And once you frame things in that window, you see them very clearly and you know where it's going to go. And then it also means you cut out a lot of the extra things that can go on in poems. I often feel, I sometimes read a poem and wish and say, well, I wish that hadn't gone on quite as long.
Do you ever do that with your own? You just
yes, but then I don't have to wish. Then I just brutally cut it.
Yeah,
it's a brutal game. I mean, you can't be sentimental with yourself, and you can't be kind to yourself. You have to cut. So there's no room for sentimentality or hanging on to extra lines if it's your own. I sometimes do feel like that with others as well.
We've got no more actual questions or comments at the moment from our audience. Hang on a minute. Let me rephrase that. Renata's just messaged, say thank you for this beautiful and powerful reading. It was awesome to see your poem bloom as part of the Poems in the City project in Warsaw just after the pandemic struck in April 2020.
Oh, lovely. You saw that. My goodness. Right. Thank you.
And another question has just come in. This again is related to the pandemic. This is from Charlie. How did the pandemic change your writing habits? Or perhaps it didn't, she says.
Well, it did actually, because at first, in the lockdown I'm used to walking. The first thing I do is I go down to the street and I start walking in as soon as I can. And very often walking, or even going and sitting in a cafe, you hear conversations going. I'm a great eavesdropper. So I'll hear conversations going by, and that will often trigger a poem. Or I'll be listening to sounds on the street, and that will trigger a poem. Or just the rhythm of walking very often just sets up the beginning of allowing a poem to be written. So that changed at first. Then I sat on my balcony a lot. And the silence, it was such a precious thing, the first silences and the way, even in the city, in the middle of the city, the nature took over. The fact that you could feel how close nature was, even through the concrete and the pavements. There would be foxes in the bins, there would be birds singing, there would be bees, suddenly there'd be a ladybird, and I'd notice it, which I might not have before, on my plant on the balcony. A dandelion turned up, and I was so delighted to see a dandelion among my plants. So things changed, there's a different level of attention. And poetry, any poetry, whether it's about huge things like world events, or whether it's close things like a detail of nature or an insect, it really is about paying close attention to the immediate surrounding, paying close attention to the words people say, paying close attention to what people mean with the words they say, paying close attention to what's in the silence. Is it really silence or is it humming with other sounds? So all of those things did change my poetry. I think I came from a space of more silence and more listening and attention that had always been there, but maybe it was more concentrated.
Right. Yeah. I do. Actually, another question come from Parveen, which is quite interesting. Actually, were you expected to choose a different career? And I find that question interesting because the question is, were you expected to choose a different career? Did you actually feel that poetry chose you? Perhaps writing and poetry chose you.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know how it is when you're small and suddenly people expect you to make choices a bit too early. They expect you to make choices about whether you're interested in science or maths or whether the arts, and they set them up in opposition. And I feel that that's a very artificial kind of thing. You know, I think science can be poetry and poetry is science, and they're all a kind of mix of things. I started writing and loving words very young, and I started drawing very young. And I think my parents just saw that and they knew that there was no question about it. So I wasn't pushed in any particular direction, but I chose very early on, and I was choosing. I know that I saw early on how words can be powerful, and I wanted to use them, and I wanted to draw. There was just nothing that could stop me doing that. So yes, I mean, poetry and art chose me. But I don't know how early that was, and I don't know if I had any other choices. I did think for a while, I almost believed that I could sing, and I really couldn't. I almost believed that I could dance, and then discovered I was too short. So all kinds of, I was doing ballet, and it didn't quite work out. So I did believe I had other skills, which I didn't really have.
The poetry and the writing definitely took charge, yeah. You found your niche, so to speak, in that creative field. We've only got about 14, 15 minutes left. There's another little question here. Venus says, thank you for a powerful and insightful session and for sharing it with us. How much time do you spend each day creating the poems?
Sometimes it's just a few, a few minutes. I'd put a line down on a page and go off and do something else. But most days, I would take the lines that I've written in all over the city or wherever I am and bring them together and begin to think about a poem that builds around it. And I'd probably spend a few hours a day on poems. They don't all work, and I throw away a lot. And now I've been told not to throw them away, but just to keep them in a stash.
I was going to ask, why throw them away? Don't you keep them for sort of back copies for reference for future? Because surely with the amount of writing and inspirational work that you do, there must be moments where you think, I had that sentence, I had that word, I had that phrase, and now for the life of me, I can't remember it.
When I started, I used to get so angry that it wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I would just crumple up the paper and throw it away. Now I've learned that even some of those crumpled bits were worth keeping. And I do now keep everything and then come back to some things later. And think, oh, yes, there's an idea there, there's something there. And you can never quite be what you were then, but you can take it and make it something that works. Or else something was there that you thought wasn't good and you think, oh, well, no, that wasn't actually... it was something that did sort of work. And then there's some that you look at and think that was really rubbish. How did I think I was going to write that?
I was just going to ask you actually, of the works that you've had published, are there poems that you look back at now, revisit and either desire to rewrite or think, oh dear me, what were I and the editor thinking when we allowed that to get put out on page 33?
Yes, well, a little bit, especially with a typo that I let go, not knowing. But yes, of course, that does happen. But it's always better. I think, there are things that I've written when I was young that I thought, oh, well, what did I, it was such an ordinary idea. But there's a kind of innocence, call it ignorance or innocence, about something you write when you're younger. And that doesn't come back. So it has its own place. And 7 books later, it's all right to say, okay, I did that. And I might not do that today, but that was me then. That was then. And it has its own time and value. And I probably wouldn't change that too much. But there are poems that I've written that I while I'm reading them, especially, I may not rewrite them in a book, but while I'm reading them, I do change whole verses sometimes. And I've done this in front of my publisher as well. So, and he's noticed.
Have you ever done it when you've been doing a live reading? I'm going to change this. Nobody will notice.
I did it today. That poem that I wrote 20 years ago that I started with, they say she must be from another country. There's a bit of a verse that I drop, and there's I end. I never learned their customs. I never knew their language. I never learned their customs. But actually, it was written as, I don't know your language or learn your ways. And I felt that was accusing the audience too much, because I and the audience are complicit in this poem. We're together. I'm not accusing the audience. I'm saying This is about the people who puff out their chest, put their feet on our necks, and break their own rules. And they are the ones I'm turning away from, not you. So I changed that pronoun. I changed that those words in the poem. I've never admitted to that in public before, but yes, that's what I do.
It's an exclusive, everybody. Can I ask you to indulge us in a little bit more reading before we go?
Oh, well.
Would that be okay?
Okay. I'll read 2. One is called Lapis Lazuli, and this is a sonnet as well. Again, it's an older poem, but, when you realize that not long ago there was a drone strike while the evacuation was happening, and the first claim was that drone strike had hit a terrorist target, and then they found that who was actually killed was a family and 6 children. This poem came back to mind, and I'll read it now. It's called Lapis Lazuli. And I was really writing it with the idea of the lapis lazuli, the stone which is found in Afghanistan, in Badakhshan mine there. And it's a very special and sacred stone. If you thirst for blue beyond ultramarine, here is the blue that stains the artist's hand, lifted out of the most precious seam in the generous heart of Badakhshan, to place an azure light in the pharaoh's eyes after he's gone, lap at the virgin's cloak, seep into the masjid walls, a prize to protect the wearer, allow the hope that a simple oar could save the prey and shield the savaged heart from harm, that in a broken land it could find a way to wrap the child in sacred blue, a charm or talisman to still the approaching drone, if you could only mind the prayer inside the stone. And I'll read one more, just because I'd like to end with a love poem, a kind of a love poem. I don't know if you've ever fallen in love with an app. Well, I did. It's the flight tracker. And so this one's about that. It's called Flight Radar. From the top of the Shard, the view unfolds down the Thames to the sea, the city laid by a trick of sight vertically in front of me. At London Bridge Station, trains slide in and out in a long, slow dance. It's not by chance that I'm here, not looking down, but up to where you are on Flight 199 coming into land. I've learned to track you on my mobile phone. However far you go, I have the app that uses the radar to trace your path. There you are now, circling down around this spire where I stand, my face reflected over your pulse in the glass. You cannot see. You have no radar for me, no app to make you look back or down to where I'm lifting my hand. Darling, I will track your flight till it is a dot that turns and banks and falls out of sight, looking into the space where you were, fingers frozen on the tiny keys. I will stay where I am in the dying light, the screen still live in my palm. Thank you. Thank you.
That's astounding, Imtiaz, absolutely astounding.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you for the lovely audience and the lovely questions.
Just thinking what you said earlier, though, about when you mentioned Carol Ann Duffy, and I was thinking about what she said about you, and saying basically if there was a laureate for the international poetry, global poet, it would have to be Imtiaz Dharker, which I thought was a really lovely thing to say.
Thank you. I can think of a few others who would fit the description because
I don't know. Not after that one. I'm just thinking the only app I've fallen in love with, sadly, is the weather app, which is a bit ridiculous, really. But I find myself looking out of the window and then looking at the weather app at the same time, almost, which is just crazy.
That could be a poem.
It could be a poem. Yeah.
I hope everyone will keep listening to poetry, and whoever is writing, keep writing. And enjoy it. Thank you. It's been lovely to be with you.
Well, we've enjoyed this evening very, very much. Extraordinary, beautiful work. And thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience as well for staying with us this evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.